The diner fell silent, as if someone had pressed pause on life itself. The hum of the coffee machine faded, the chatter froze mid-sentence, and forks hovered in midair. Mara Collins, a 38-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a warm smile, stood by the corner booth holding a $10 bill between her fingers. Across from her sat an elderly man in a gray sweater, staring down at his untouched slice of pie. "You don't have to, ma'am," he murmured, embarrassed, his voice trembling. Mara smiled softly. "I insist. It's just pie and coffee. Consider it on the house." The manager behind the counter looked up, puzzled. One of the younger waitresses whispered, "She's really paying for him." But Mara didn't hear. In that moment, the world narrowed to the old man's grateful eyes and the soft rustle of the bill as she tucked it beneath the receipt. No one in that small-town diner could have guessed that this small act of kindness would echo far beyond those yellow walls. Outside, the sky over upstate New York had turned the color of burnt copper. The windows reflected rows of faded booths and the warm hum of neon signs flickering "Open." It was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the air smelled faintly of bacon grease, and regulars came more for company than for food. Mara loved it here, even if her paycheck barely stretched past rent and gas. After 2 decades of double shifts, she'd learned to find grace in small things, the comfort of routine, the rhythm of kindness. She lived alone in a modest apartment above a laundromat, with a single potted fern and a coffee mug that read, "Be kind anyway." That night, kindness was all she could offer. The old man's wallet had slipped from his pocket earlier, and she'd seen the panic flash across his face. Instead of watching him fumble in shame, she paid quietly and walked away before he could protest. When she turned back, he was still sitting there, eyes wet, hands shaking slightly around his coffee mug. "Thank you," he said again, almost to himself. Mara nodded once and smiled, the kind that carries no expectation. She didn't know that someone at the counter, a man in a crisp white shirt with a lawyer's briefcase beside him, had been watching the entire exchange. That night, as she wiped down the counter and stacked the ketchup bottles, the lawyer approached her booth, pretending to settle his own tab. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Mara shrugged. "Maybe not. But someone has to start." He studied her for a moment, as if memorizing her words. Then he simply nodded, left a generous tip, and walked out into the chill November air. Mara never saw the old man leave. She just remembered the faint jingle of the bell over the diner door, and how, for some reason, it sounded heavier that night, like it carried something more than cold air inside. She didn't know that by morning, that same sound, a knock on her apartment door, would change everything. Morning crept slowly into the narrow apartment above the laundromat, spilling through thin curtains that smelled faintly of detergent and rain. Mara stirred awake before her alarm, a habit formed from years of early shifts and quiet responsibility. The world outside was still half asleep, the street below humming with the first buses and the distant bark of a dog. She brewed her usual cup of coffee, the cheap kind that left a bitter trace on her tongue, and sat by the window watching the sun climb between rooftops like a cautious secret. She thought briefly about the old man from last night, wondering if he had made it home safely, or if he would ever know how much that $10 meant to her paycheck. But she had long ago learned not to expect gratitude from the world. Kindness to her was its own reward. She tied her hair back, slipped into her worn shoes, and prepared for another long day at the diner. The same faces, the same chipped mugs, the same steady rhythm that kept her life from unraveling. A sudden knock broke the silence. It wasn't the light tap of a neighbor or the impatient rhythm of a delivery. It was measured 3 deliberate knocks that seemed to hold their breath between each sound. Mara hesitated, mug halfway to her lips. Through the peephole, she saw a tall man in a charcoal gray coat, holding a leather briefcase and a small envelope. He looked out of place in the narrow hallway with its peeling paint and humming fluorescent light. When she opened the door, the man gave a polite nod. "Miss Collins?" His voice was steady, professional, touched with something gentler than formality. "My name is Richard Hale. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Mr. Henry Lowell." Mara blinked, the name unfamiliar. "I think you have the wrong person," she said carefully. But the lawyer smiled in that patient way people do when they're used to disbelief. "I assure you I don't. Mr. Lowell asked that this be delivered to you personally." He handed her the envelope, and with it a small brass key that glimmered dully in the morning light. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of thick stationery, the kind that carried the faint smell of cedar and age. The handwriting was shaky but elegant. "To the woman who remembered kindness when the world forgot. This is not charity, it's a promise kept." Beneath the signature, the name Henry Lowell appeared again, followed by an address in Vermont. Mara looked up, confusion tightening her chest. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. Richard adjusted his glasses, his expression softening. Henry Lowell was a former industrialist, a widower who retired here a few years ago. He passed away peacefully last night. The words settled like dust between them, fragile and unreal. "He mentioned meeting you at a diner. He said you reminded him of his late wife, who believed small acts of kindness could heal what money never could." For a long moment Mara couldn't speak. She remembered the tremor in the old man's hands, the watery smile, the quiet dignity of his eyes. She had thought he was just another lonely soul seeking warmth in a cup of coffee. Now she realized she had unknowingly stepped into the final chapter of someone's life story. Richard continued, his tone professional yet respectful. "Mr. Lowell's will leaves you a property, a residence on Pine Hill Road in Vermont. The key you're holding is for that house. I've been instructed to escort you there whenever you're ready." Mara almost laughed, the absurdity of it striking her before the reality did. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "I didn't even know him." The lawyer shook his head gently. "He knew you enough to trust that you would understand." That afternoon, she called in sick for the first time in years. As the bus rolled north through the fading autumn light, she watched the landscape change from crowded streets to open fields dusted with frost. The world outside the window looked like a painting she'd never been invited into, quiet, expensive, far removed from the clatter of plates and the hum of diner chatter. When the bus turned off the main road, Mara saw it a sprawling estate framed by ancient oaks, its windows glinting faintly like watchful eyes. The driveway curved through a field of golden leaves, leading to a white mansion that looked untouched by time. Richard met her at the gate, the key still resting in her palm. "He built this place for his wife in the 1960 seconds, he said softly. "After she passed, he closed most of it off. Until yesterday, no one else had ever been invited back in." The door creaked open with a sigh, releasing a breath of air scented with wood polish and memories. Inside, everything was frozen, in a kind of elegant stillness. The piano draped in dust, the portraits on the wall watching silently. Mara stepped into the foyer, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The lawyer handed her a folder containing the legal documents, but his voice lowered as he added, "There's something else, a letter addressed to you, left on the mantel." Mara crossed the room slowly, her reflection trailing across the polished surface of the grand piano. On the mantel lay another envelope, this one thinner, sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp shaped like a heart. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. "Mara," it began, "I didn't tell you who I was because I wanted to see if kindness still existed without reward. You reminded me that it does. This house, and everything within it, is my way of saying thank you and goodbye." Tears blurred her vision as she read the final line. "Please, fill this house with life again, it deserves laughter." And so Mara folded the letter carefully and looked around at the grand, silent room. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, painting the dust in gold. For the first time in years, she felt something unclench inside her, the quiet certainty that what she had given freely had come back to her, not as wealth, but as proof that goodness still mattered in a world that had almost forgotten how to see it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper of gratitude, and the mansion stood waiting, its door open wide. For the first time in her adult life, Mara awoke without an alarm, wrapped in quiet so deep it felt almost sacred. The sun filtered through lace curtains embroidered decades ago, drawing shifting patterns across the oak floors, while dust motes swirled lazily in the beams of light like fragments of forgotten dreams. The house was still, too still, and for a moment she wondered whether she was meant to be there at all. The marble foyer and polished railings seemed to watch her as she moved, the walls whispering stories she hadn't earned the right to hear. Downstairs, Richard Hale was waiting with a folder of documents, his coat neatly folded over a chair, his expression professional but softened by something almost paternal. He explained that several relatives had contested Mr. Lowell's will, claiming Mara had manipulated an old man's generosity, and that a hearing had been scheduled in 2 days' time. The words hit her like cold water, stripping away the fragile calm that had settled over the morning. "They think I tricked him?" she asked quietly, disbelief trembling in her voice. Richard nodded grimly, adjusting his glasses. "His nephew, a man named Brian Lowell, has hired a private investigator. He's suggesting you sought financial gain through deception." "Oh." Mara stared at the floor, anger and fear tangling inside her chest, like roots competing for air. She had spent her life working double shifts, surviving on tips and stale coffee, and now, for the first time, she was being accused of greed. Richard leaned forward, voice low and firm. "The best thing you can do is stay calm. Mr. Lowell left instructions anticipating this. There are letters, bank transfers, dated receipts, evidence proving your meeting was pure coincidence." His tone softened as he added, "But you'll have to face them." 2 days later, the hearing was held in a paneled courthouse that smelled faintly of varnish and rain-soaked wool. Brian Lowell arrived in an expensive charcoal suit, his smile polished but his eyes hard. He spoke with the casual arrogance of someone born into wealth, his words laced with pity disguised as civility. "My uncle was lonely," he told the judge, "and she took advantage of that. A clever performance at a diner, a few kind words, and suddenly she inherits an estate worth millions." Mara sat motionless beside Richard, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, drawing a deep breath. Her voice, though quiet, carried across the room with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I didn't ask for anything," she said. "He was a customer who forgot his wallet, and I paid for his meal. That's all. I didn't know who he was, and I didn't expect anything in return. I just didn't want him to feel small." The room fell still. Even Brian's smirk faltered, though only for a moment. Richard placed a small envelope on the table, sliding it toward the judge. Inside was a handwritten note from Henry Lowell, dated 2 weeks before his death, confirming every word she'd said. She expected nothing, and that's why she deserves everything. The judge read it silently, then nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a chapter. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed like thunder, final, irreversible, liberating. Mara exhaled, a tremor of disbelief running through her as the lawyer beside her smiled faintly. Brian left without a word, his expensive shoes clicking across the marble floor like an afterthought fading into the distance. That evening, rain began to fall over the estate, a slow, steady curtain washing the world clean. Mara stood on the porch beneath the soft glow of the lanterns, watching water cascade down the steps. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel foreign. It felt like something entrusted, not owned, a story handed down through grace, not inheritance. Inside, she lit the fireplace and opened a dusty photo album she'd found on a side table. The first picture showed Henry Lowell and his wife standing beside the same fireplace decades earlier, their hands clasped, their smiles easy and unguarded. Beneath it, a small inscription read, "Build warmth where the world grows cold." Hours passed as the flames dimmed, the house slowly breathing again, no longer empty but alive with memory. Mara realized then that the gift she'd received wasn't wealth or luxury, it was the chance to continue someone else's unfinished kindness. She would open the doors, restore the garden, and turn the mansion into a place that welcomed those who had nowhere else to go. Weeks later, the diner's regulars began hearing stories about her, that the woman who once refilled their coffee cups now ran a community shelter in Vermont, that the mansion with the white porch lights had become a refuge for the weary, where the smell of fresh bread replaced the scent of dust, and laughter once again echoed down its hallways. One evening, as the last light faded behind the hills, Mara walked through the front hall, pausing by the grand piano covered in sunlight. She traced her fingers across the keys and whispered a quiet thank you to the old man, to the moment in the diner, to the universe for letting kindness find its way back. In the quiet hum of twilight, she understood that what began with a $10 bill had become something far greater. It wasn't about the mansion or the money. It was about the proof that one small act, given without thought of return, could ripple through time until it rewrote the ending of a stranger's story. The fire crackled softly behind her as the camera of the world seemed to pull back, framing her silhouette against the glow. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the earth shining and new. And there, in that vast and gentle silence, Mara smiled not because she had gained something, but because she had finally given everything she had ever wanted to believe in. Autumn had begun to surrender to winter when the first invitation arrived, printed on thick ivory paper that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. It came from the mayor's office, requesting Mara Collins' presence at a charity gala honoring local acts of compassion that restored faith in humanity. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The woman who had once scraped together gas money from crumpled tips was now being asked to attend an event where people measured generosity in millions. For a moment, she considered throwing the invitation away. She wanted no spotlight, no applause. But something inside her whispered that Henry Lowell would have gone, smiling that gentle smile of his that never asked for thanks. On the night of the gala, the mansion's windows glowed softly as Mara prepared to leave, her reflection caught between light and shadow. The black dress she wore was simple, borrowed from a neighbor, and her hair was tied loosely, revealing streaks of silver that the years had painted with quiet pride. Richard Hale waited in the foyer, still her steady guide through the strange corridors of wealth and law. "You look like you belong," he said kindly, offering his arm. And Mara laughed a low, unguarded sound that filled the room like sunlight breaking through fog. "No one really belongs anywhere," she replied. "We just do our best to be kind where we stand." The event was held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel whose chandeliers sparkled like constellations caught in crystal. Tables gleamed with polished silver and glasses rimmed with gold. The air smelled faintly of orchids and champagne. As Mara entered, conversations faltered just for a heartbeat before resuming with the polite hum of curiosity. She could feel eyes turning toward her, some admiring, others calculating. Among them was Brian Lowell, impeccably dressed, his expression a mix of disbelief and resentment. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture that was neither greeting nor threat, just acknowledgement of unfinished business. The mayor spoke of compassion and unity, of a world fractured by indifference and the rare souls who still believed in kindness. When Mara's name was announced, the applause began hesitantly, then grew into something warmer, genuine. She walked to the stage with measured steps, her heart thudding like distant thunder. Under the lights, she felt both exposed and untouchable, a symbol of something larger than herself. The microphone crackled softly as she began to speak, her voice low but steady. "I'm not sure I deserve this," she said. "I only did what anyone should do. I paid for a meal, and somehow it turned into a story. But I think the story isn't really about me. It's about remembering that we all have the power to make someone's day a little lighter, and that sometimes kindness finds its way back when we least expect it." Oh, the room fell silent in that fragile moment, the kind of silence that holds breath rather than absence. Even Brian looked down, his glass motionless in his hand. Then came the applause, not thunderous, but sincere, a wave that rolled through the room like a tide finally finding its shore. Later, as the crowd mingled and the pianist played softly near the corner, Brian approached her. Up close, he looked older than she remembered, the polish of arrogance worn thin by something heavier. "You made quite a speech," he said, his tone careful. "I didn't expect you to handle all this attention with such grace." Mara met his gaze calmly, her smile faint but unflinching. "Neither did I," she replied. "But I've learned that grace isn't about deserving anything. It's about what you do when the world is watching, or when it isn't." He hesitated, his voice dropping lower. "For what it's worth, I was wrong about you. My uncle saw something I couldn't." The admission hung between them, brittle and honest. Mara simply nodded, unwilling to salt the wound of a man who was finally learning humility. "Maybe now you'll see it in someone else," she said gently. Outside, the night air was crisp and carried the faint scent of snow. Richard joined her on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. "You handled that beautifully," he said, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. "Henry would have been proud." Mara looked up at the glittering windows of the ballroom, where laughter still echoed faintly, and felt a strange calm settle in her chest. "He already gave me everything I needed," she whispered. "Now it's my turn to pass it on." Over the following months, she turned the mansion into something remarkable, a quiet refuge for women starting over, a space filled with warmth and purpose instead of wealth and silence. Volunteers came, drawn by the story that had traveled farther than she ever could. The grand rooms that once held dust and shadows now rang with the sound of footsteps, laughter, and music. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon, the gardens bloomed again under careful hands, and the piano in the parlor was played every evening by a teenager who had once slept in her car. Mara would walk the halls sometimes after everyone had gone to bed, listening to the whisper of life returning to a place that had once mourned. She never hung portraits of herself, never added her name to the foundation plaque. Instead, she placed Henry Lowell's photo on the mantel with his wife beside him, surrounded by fresh flowers that she changed every Sunday. "You were right," she would say softly, standing in the golden light of morning. "Kindness doesn't end where you give it. It keeps walking long after you've stopped." One evening, as snow began to fall over Vermont, she stood by the window, watching the world turn white, her reflection merging with the frost. The camera of life seemed to pull back again, revealing the mansion glowing like a lighthouse against the dark, a symbol not of wealth, but of mercy rediscovered. And in that serene silence, Mara smiled a quiet, enduring smile, knowing she had finally learned what Henry had meant in his final letter. That love, when freely given, becomes a legacy the world can never take away. Winter deepened its hold on Vermont, wrapping the hills in sheets of silver ice and muting the world beneath a hush of snow. Inside the mansion, warmth glowed from every window as laughter and conversation filled the once empty halls. Mara had never meant to become anyone's leader, yet somehow her name had turned into a quiet promise, whispered among those who came seeking shelter. They arrived carrying suitcases filled with fear and hope, and she met each of them at the door with the same gentle smile that had once disarmed a stranger in a diner. What she built was more than a home, it was a breathing, living testament to the truth that kindness, when passed forward, multiplies in unexpected directions. But peace, she learned, was rarely permanent. It began one gray afternoon when a black car pulled up the driveway, its tires crunching over frozen gravel. The driver's door opened, revealing a woman in her 50s, sharp-featured, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses that reflected the mansion's pale facade. She introduced herself as Clara Weston, legal counsel for one of Henry Lowell's former business partners. Her tone was polite, yet her words carried the chill of litigation. "Miss Collins," she said, stepping across the threshold without waiting for an invitation, "there are unresolved matters concerning the ownership of this estate. My client believes part of this property was wrongfully transferred prior to Mr. Lowell's passing." Mara felt the familiar flutter of fear in her chest, the echo of old battles she thought she'd already survived. Richard Hale, ever composed, stood at her side, his calm voice cutting through the frost. "The estate transfer was legally validated months ago, Miss Weston, unless your client possesses new evidence. I suggest we move this conversation to a less intrusive venue." Clara removed her glasses, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she replied, "though I imagine the public would find this story fascinating, a waitress inheriting millions while others were cut out entirely." Her smile was thin, calculated, the kind used by people who turned compassion into currency. For a heartbeat, Mara considered defending herself, explaining once again that she had asked for nothing. But something inside her shifted. She had learned that defending kindness to the cruel was like explaining light to those who refused to open their eyes. Instead, she simply said, "You're welcome to look around, but you won't find anything here worth stealing." The woman's eyes flickered, uncertain whether the words were humility or warning. That night, Mara walked the long corridor lined with portraits, each frame gleaming faintly in the candlelight. She stopped before the painting of Henry and his wife, her fingertips brushing the gilded edge as if seeking courage through memory. "They'll try to take it again," she whispered, "but they can't take what it means." The house creaked softly in reply, its timbers settling against the cold. She smiled, taking it as an answer. 2 days later, an unexpected ally appeared, a journalist named Evelyn Price, who had once covered the court hearing months earlier. She arrived unannounced, camera slung over her shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold. "I'm not here for a story," Evelyn said, her breath fogging in the air. "I just wanted to see if the rumors were true. People say you turned a millionaire's mansion into a community center. I thought maybe I'd see it for myself." Mara led her through the house, past the laughter echoing from the kitchen, the warmth radiating from the hearth, the children painting by the window. The journalist's eyes softened. "You're not hiding from your past," she said quietly. "You're rewriting it." When the article appeared a week later, it wasn't an exposé, it was an elegy to decency. The headline read, "The Woman Who Made Kindness Her Inheritance." Donations began arriving anonymously, some from former employees of Henry Lowell, others from people who had read her story and remembered the better parts of themselves. Even Brian Lowell sent a brief letter, acknowledging his uncle's wisdom with an apology scrawled awkwardly beneath his signature. Mara read it only once, then tucked it away in a drawer with the rest of the letters she kept but never answered. One evening, as snow fell softly against the windows, Mara stood with Richard in the parlor, watching the volunteers set up a holiday dinner for the residents. "You realize this place has become something bigger than a shelter," he said. "It's practically a movement." She smiled, stirring the pot of spiced cider in her hands. "It's not a movement," she replied. "It's just people remembering how to be good." Later that night, when the guests had gone to sleep and the fire burned low, she stepped outside into the cold. The air was so crisp it felt alive, filled with the faint scent of pine and smoke. Above her, the stars glittered like frost caught on invisible branches. For the first time, she spoke aloud to the quiet sky. "Thank you, Henry," she said softly, "for believing that one small kindness could change the ending of a story." "Oh." As she turned to go back inside, she noticed a faint glimmer beneath the oak tree near the gate, something half buried in the snow. Curious, she knelt and brushed the frost away until her fingers closed around a small silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph of Henry's wife and a folded note so fragile it nearly crumbled in her hands. The handwriting, familiar and steady, read, "When the house is filled with laughter again, you'll know I kept my promise." "Oh?" Tears welled in Mara's eyes as she looked up at the glowing windows of the mansion, where silhouettes moved behind the curtains, shadows of lives rebuilt. She understood then that this place had never been about inheritance or justice. It had been a bridge between two lonely souls, separated by time but connected by the same belief, that compassion is never wasted, even when the world tries to forget it. As the wind rose and snow began to fall again, Mara stood quietly beneath the oak, the locket warm against her palm. The camera of the story would linger there for a while, capturing the image of a woman bathed in the soft light of the mansion she had once feared to claim, her figure framed against the endless white. Then it would fade slowly, leaving behind only the echo of her voice and the whisper of a truth older than grief, stronger than greed, that kindness, once given, never truly dies. It simply finds another heart willing to carry it forward. The snow melted slowly as spring crept back across the hills, breathing color into the gray bones of Vermont. The mansion's garden, once frozen and forgotten, began to stir again with new life. Volunteers planted tulips where weeds had grown, children chased each other through the orchard, and laughter spilled from open windows like sunlight breaking through old dust. Mara often stood at the top of the steps in the morning, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, watching it all unfold with the quiet disbelief of someone still learning that joy could exist without fear. The air smelled of soil and cinnamon bread, and for a fleeting moment the world felt simple again. Yet beneath that calm surface, she sensed the faint hum of change, the uneasy rhythm that always arrived when good things began to draw attention. The foundation had grown faster than she expected. Letters and donations poured in from strangers, each carrying their own story of gratitude or regret. Some wanted to help, others to belong, but a few came seeking something less pure: credit, control, ownership of a kindness they hadn't earned. Richard had warned her gently that expansion came with consequence, that every noble act cast a longer shadow the higher it rose toward the light. Mara nodded at the time, believing she understood, but reality proved heavier than words. One afternoon, she received an invitation from a powerful developer named Samuel Drake, whose company had offered to partner with the foundation. His letter was eloquent, respectful, and laced with the kind of promises that sounded like opportunities but smelled faintly of compromise. Richard advised caution, suggesting they meet on neutral ground. The meeting was set at a glass-walled restaurant overlooking the frozen river, a place where the wealthy came to be seen pretending they were ordinary. Samuel arrived precisely on time, his handshake firm, his smile polished like marble. "Miss Collins," he began smoothly, "you've built something extraordinary here, a sanctuary of hope. I want to help you take it nationwide. Imagine 10 mansions like yours, across 10 cities, each one changing lives." His words glowed with sincerity, but his eyes betrayed calculation, the glint of someone who saw charity as branding and compassion as market share. Mara listened quietly, stirring her coffee without sipping. When he finished, she said softly, "That's a generous offer, Mr. Drake, but I think kindness loses its meaning when it's franchised." He laughed, not mockingly but with the confident amusement of a man who mistook resistance for negotiation. "Miss Collins," he said, leaning forward, "the world runs on visibility. You can't help people if you stay small." Mara met his gaze evenly, her voice steady. "And you can't save souls by selling them." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the sound of the river beneath the ice. When she left the restaurant, the air outside felt colder than it should have. She knew men like him didn't accept no for an answer. They reshaped it, repackaged it, waited until the world forgot why it had been said in the first place. Still, she felt no fear, only a strange calm born of conviction. The mansion was not a brand, and compassion was not a commodity. Weeks passed, and rumors began to circulate online, whispers that Mara had misused donations, that the foundation's funds were unaccounted for. Anonymous articles appeared, seeded by invisible hands. Volunteers worried, reporters called, and strangers on social media argued over whether her kindness had ever been real. The accusations hit her like stones she couldn't see coming, and for a while the laughter in the mansion dimmed. But when doubt spread through the halls, Mara gathered everyone in the dining room, standing beneath the chandelier that had once belonged to Henry Lowell. "If you believe in why we're here," she said softly, "then you already know the truth. We don't prove kindness by defending it, we prove it by living it." Her words settled over them like a quiet prayer, and slowly the panic ebbed. People kept working, cooking, helping, believing. Richard uncovered evidence tracing the false claims back to a media firm owned by one of Drake's subsidiaries. When the truth came out, the scandal collapsed overnight, leaving only silence and the bitter scent of shame clinging to those who had doubted. But Mara didn't celebrate. She had learned that victory in the face of malice never felt like triumph. It felt like survival. That evening, she walked the property alone, her shoes sinking into the thawing earth. The mansion's windows glowed behind her, each one a beacon against the growing dusk. Somewhere in the distance, the river cracked open under the weight of spring, releasing its song of renewal. Mara stopped by the old oak near the gate, tracing her fingers over the bark where she had once found Henry's locket. "You were right," she whispered. "Kindness doesn't end when it's doubted. It endures because it's doubted." A breeze moved through the branches, scattering petals like snow. She smiled, feeling a warmth rise through her chest that no accusation could touch. The world would always test goodness, she realized, because goodness reflected what it feared most, its own absence. Later that night, she sat by the fireplace with a notebook on her lap, the pages filled with lists of repairs and budgets, but also names people who had come and gone, stories that had intertwined with her own. She wrote not as a record, but as a promise, that every act of decency, no matter how small, would be remembered. When she closed the book, the firelight flickered across her face, softening the lines of exhaustion into something almost luminous. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of laughter from the dormitories, the sound of hope rebuilding itself in the dark. For the first time in months, Mara allowed herself to rest, leaning back in the chair once owned by a man who had trusted her with his final lesson. The mansion was no longer his, and not truly hers. It belonged to everyone who believed that kindness, though fragile, was still the most enduring form of strength. As the flames burned low, she whispered one last thought into the quiet room. "The world keeps testing the same truth," she said, "and every time it forgets that kindness doesn't need proof. It just needs witnesses." Then she closed her eyes and the scene faded slowly, the camera pulling back from the warmth of the fire to the vast night outside, where the stars flickered above the sleeping house like distant reminders that even in darkness, light endures for those who choose to keep it burning. Summer rolled over Vermont like a slow exhale, stretching daylight into golden hours that lingered past reason. The hills glowed with a patient green, and the mansion, once a monument to silence, now thrummed with life and the noise of small miracles. Every evening, laughter drifted through the open windows, mingling with the scent of lilac and rain. To the townspeople, Mara Collins had become both a mystery and a legend, a woman who had turned inheritance into hope and wealth into work. But to those who lived within the mansion's walls, she was simply Miss Mara, the one who listened, who remembered everyone's story, and who believed in second chances even when no one else did. The foundation had grown in quiet, organic ways. One family helped another, one story sparked the next. Still, Mara knew that the more goodness bloomed, the more it drew eyes that misunderstood it. Success had a way of making the selfless look suspicious. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an email marked "Urgent," forwarded from the town council. A new zoning proposal had been introduced, one that could restrict the mansion's use as a shelter under the guise of preserving community character. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, but its intent was clear. Someone with influence wanted her gone. Richard Hale, now more friend than lawyer, studied the document late into the night, his expression darkening with every paragraph. "It's clever," he said finally, tapping the paper with a pen. "They're not attacking the foundation directly, they're tightening regulations until you can't afford to comply." Mara leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling around the mug of untouched tea. "Do we know who's behind it?" Richard hesitated. "Samuel Drake's company has been buying property all over this valley. If he can pressure the town into rezoning, he can build luxury retreats here." "Oh?" The news settled over her like frost, but she didn't flinch. "Then we fight," she said quietly, her tone not defiant but resolute. "Not for the building, for what it stands for." Over the following weeks, the fight took shape in city meetings and newspaper editorials, in whispers traded in grocery aisles and rallies held on courthouse steps. Volunteers spoke, townspeople signed petitions, and stories of the mansion's impact began circulating online again, carried by people who had once found refuge under its roof. Mara refused interviews, but her silence only made her presence larger, a figure of calm amid noise, conviction amid corruption. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, the council held its final vote. The meeting room was packed, the air heavy with the blend of perfume, paper, and quiet fury. Samuel Drake sat in the front row, his suit immaculate, his confidence cold and unshaken. When the chairman opened the floor, Richard stood to present their case, his voice clear and deliberate, every word a thread of logic woven through emotion. But when the vote ended, the count fell against them 5-4. The motion passed. The mansion would lose its operating permit within 60 days. The room erupted, some in anger, others in silence too deep for sound. Mara didn't move. She felt the weight of disappointment settle through her bones like rain through soil, slow and inevitable. Drake's smile was small, almost polite. "Progress is never personal," he said, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "It's just business." She met his gaze steadily. "That's what they said about kindness once. It wasn't profitable either." The following morning, the mansion awoke to news of the defeat. But something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, there was motion, determined, purposeful, unstoppable. Residents and volunteers began organizing, cleaning, restoring, and documenting every inch of the house. "If they take it," Mara said, standing before them, "they'll have to take something alive." Her words spread across the town, picked up by reporters, echoed in editorials, and whispered through social media until the story caught fire. Donations surged. Lawyers offered pro bono help. A petition to overturn the zoning vote reached tens of thousands of signatures within days. Then came the twist no one foresaw. An anonymous envelope arrived at the mayor's office containing old property records and signed letters revealing that Samuel Drake's company had falsified ownership documents on several nearby estates. Within 48 hours, the council rescinded the zoning change pending investigation. The story broke across the state, and Drake's empire began to fracture under scrutiny. When Richard brought her the news, Mara didn't celebrate. She simply sat by the window, watching sunlight flicker through the branches. "It wasn't revenge," she said softly. "It was gravity. Lies fall the way they're meant to." He smiled faintly. "You know, you're starting to sound like a philosopher." She shook her head. "No, just a waitress who learned how to listen to silence." "Oh." The following weekend, the mansion hosted a community festival, part thank you, part healing. The air was thick with music and the smell of grilled food, children running barefoot across the lawn, while neighbors who had once doubted her brought homemade pies as peace offerings. As evening fell, fairy lights twined around the porch railings, and the sound of a guitar drifted across the field. Mara stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, hands tucked in her coat pockets, eyes reflecting the glow of 100 small lights. Richard joined her, handing her a glass of lemonade instead of champagne. "You realize," he said, "you just beat one of the most powerful developers in the state." Mara smiled, her gaze distant. "I didn't beat anyone," she said. "The truth did. I just stayed long enough to see it happen." The music swelled, the sky deepened into indigo, and laughter rippled through the night like a promise kept. In that moment, Mara understood that winning didn't always mean keeping what was yours. Sometimes it meant protecting what could never belong to anyone. The mansion wasn't safe forever, nor was she, but the story had outgrown both. Kindness had taken root in soil far beyond her reach, carried by voices she would never meet, shaping lives she would never see. When the last guests left and the lights dimmed, she stood alone beneath the old oak where Henry's locket still hung hidden in its hollow. The night was cool, the stars sharp and clear above her. She whispered to the dark, not asking for anything, not even peace, just gratitude. "You were right, Henry," she said. "Kindness doesn't fade, it finds its way home." Oh, the camera of the world would linger there again, drawing back slowly the woman, the mansion, the soft hum of life beneath a boundless sky, and for one final breathless moment, the silence itself seemed to bow in reverence to what she had built. Then the scene dissolved into light, carrying with it the unspoken truth that every act of goodness, no matter how fragile, survives in the hearts of those brave enough to believe it still matters. By the time autumn returned, the hills around the mansion burned in shades of gold and crimson, as if the land itself had chosen to celebrate survival. The town that once doubted Mara now looked to her for quiet guidance. The same people who had signed petitions against her foundation now brought supplies, volunteered at the shelter, and left thank-you notes at the gate. Every week, someone new arrived at her door, a single mother escaping debt, a young man leaving addiction behind, an old veteran seeking company after years of silence. Mara greeted them all with the same unassuming grace, as though she had been expecting them her entire life. The house seemed to breathe differently now, no longer burdened by its past, but alive in the rhythm of shared purpose and unspoken gratitude. Yet, even peace carries its own ache. Mara had built a world of belonging for everyone but herself, and sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, she would walk the corridors alone, listening to the faint sounds of sleeping souls and wondering if she truly belonged among them. She had become a symbol, a woman others projected their hope upon, but symbols, she knew, rarely found rest. The portrait of Henry and his wife still hung above the mantel, their faces calm and kind, forever frozen in the same serenity she longed to understand. One evening, while sorting through an old trunk left in the attic, she found a sealed envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. It was Henry's, dated nearly 30 years before his death, written to himself. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "If ever this house stands silent again, let someone with a whole heart live here, someone who remembers what it means to give without measure." The letter wasn't meant for her, yet somehow it found its way into her hands, bridging decades through coincidence or fate. She read it 3 times, her throat tightening with the realization that she had fulfilled a wish he had never expected to come true. Later that week, she invited Richard to the garden where the trees had begun to shed their first leaves. The air carried the soft scent of earth and wood smoke, and sunlight broke through the branches in trembling threads. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "why some people spend their lives taking while others can't stop giving?" Richard smiled. His expression lined with the wisdom of a man who had seen too much to pretend at answers. "Maybe it's because giving feels like proof that we still matter," he said quietly, "and some people are too afraid to need that kind of proof." Their conversation drifted to Henry, to the strange way one encounter had set everything in motion. "He was testing the world one last time," Richard said, "and you passed a test you never knew you were taking." Mara looked toward the horizon, where the light caught on the glass of the distant river. "Maybe it wasn't a test," she replied softly. "Maybe it was an invitation, one person asking another to keep believing." As the weeks passed, word of her foundation began reaching beyond the state. Universities invited her to speak, journalists wanted features, and philanthropists offered grants, but Mara declined most requests. She had no interest in stages or headlines. She believed that the moment kindness became spectacle, it began to lose its pulse. Still, one invitation caught her attention, a letter from a school in the nearby town asking if she would meet their students for a storytelling event. The teacher wrote, "They want to hear how a waitress became a leader without changing who she was." When Mara arrived at the small gymnasium, she was met by rows of eager faces, children holding notebooks, eyes wide with curiosity. She didn't bring speeches or slides. She only told them about the diner, the old man, the pie, and the $10 bill that had changed everything. "Sometimes," she said, "we think miracles look like thunder or light, but most of them look like ordinary moments we almost walk past." The students listened in perfect stillness, and when she finished, one girl raised her hand. "Do you ever wish you'd kept the money instead?" The question made Mara laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine affection. "No," she said, "because keeping it would have ended the story right there. Giving it away was what made it begin." That night, as she drove back to the mansion through the winding back roads, the headlights carved a path through falling leaves. She thought about that little girl's question and realized it was the simplest way to measure a life, whether the choices you made opened stories or closed them. The mansion glowed ahead like a promise kept, its windows warm against the chill. Inside, volunteers were preparing a late dinner for the newcomers, the smell of bread and garlic filling the air. Someone had placed fresh flowers beneath Henry's portrait again, lilies this time, her favorite. After everyone had eaten, Mara stood at the doorway, watching as laughter rippled across the long table. For a moment, she saw it all layered together. The diner's dim lights, the trembling hand of an old man, the jingle of a doorbell, the quiet knock that had changed her life. It felt like standing at the center of time itself, where every act of kindness converged into something larger, invisible, and unbreakable. She stepped outside for a breath of cool air, the night thick with the scent of rain. The oak tree shimmered with dew, and in its hollow she still kept Henry's locket, a small, shining relic of everything that had begun with a cup of coffee and an unpaid bill. She touched it lightly and whispered, "We did it, Henry. The house remembers." "Oh, well." Above her, the clouds parted, revealing a scatter of stars reflected in the wet earth. The camera of the story would rise slowly here, pulling back from her solitary figure framed in gold light and shadow, the mansion behind her glowing like a heart beating in the dark. And as the wind moved through the trees, carrying laughter from the house to the quiet hills beyond, it felt as though the world itself was exhaling, releasing its long-held breath of doubt, finally believing, if only for tonight, that kindness could still save it. The first frost of November arrived quietly, tracing silver edges across the fields and rooftops, as if the world had decided to whisper instead of shout. The mansion, now fully alive with purpose, stood like a lighthouse against the pale morning fog. Inside, the hum of routine filled every corridor, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the muffled rhythm of footsteps, and the laughter of people who had once believed life had no more room for them. To outsiders, it looked like a miracle. To Mara Collins, it felt like a fragile balance that needed constant tending, a candle that survived not because of its flame, but because someone kept shielding it from the wind. She had grown used to small emergencies, broken pipes, lost funding, nights spent calming someone's panic, but this morning was different. Richard Hale appeared at her office door, his usual calm strained by something heavier than paperwork. "You have a visitor," he said, his voice quiet. "He says he's Henry Lowell's brother." Mara froze, the words like a door she hadn't realized was still closed. "I thought Henry had no surviving family," she said. But Richard shook his head. "Neither did I. His name's Thomas. He's waiting in the library." The man who stood when she entered was older than Henry had been, his frame lean but upright, his eyes sharp despite their age. He extended his hand, and though his grip was gentle, there was an intensity behind it that made her heart quicken. "You must be Mara Collins," he said. "My brother spoke about you before he passed. I was living abroad when it happened." His gaze wandered around the room, taking in the paintings, the books, the quiet life that had taken root in his brother's former home. "He always said this house felt too empty for its size. I can see it's no longer empty." They sat across from each other as sunlight pooled between them, the silence weighted not by tension but by something like reverence. "Why did you come?" Mara asked finally. Thomas smiled faintly. "To see what kindness looks like when it grows up," he replied. "Henry told me you reminded him of someone, his wife, Eleanor. She used to believe that generosity was a kind of faith. I lost mine a long time ago, but I think he found it again through you." The words caught in her throat. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too small for what she felt. Instead, she asked about Henry, his youth, his laughter, the man behind the quiet wisdom she'd only glimpsed in fragments. Thomas spoke for hours, painting his brother not as the myth she'd built in memory, but as a human being full of flaws, humor, and old regrets. They laughed over small stories, mourned in comfortable silences, and when he rose to leave, Thomas placed a small wooden box on the table. "He left this for you," he said softly, "said you'd know when to open it." Long after he'd gone, Mara sat staring at the box, its surface worn smooth by decades of touch. When she finally lifted the lid, she found a folded letter and a delicate key resting atop a music box mechanism. The letter, written in Henry's elegant hand, read, "This key belongs to the attic room. It was my wife's sanctuary, a place where she wrote letters she never sent. I think you'll understand her better than anyone else ever could." Curiosity mingled with awe as Mara climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking softly beneath her feet. The attic smelled of cedar and old paper, the kind of scent that carried memory instead of dust. In the corner stood a writing desk, its drawers half open, filled with pages yellowed by time. She opened one, then another unsent letters written by Eleanor to people she had helped, each one beginning the same way. "I never told you what your kindness meant to me, but it changed the way I saw the world." Mara read until the light faded, her tears smudging the ink into small constellations. It was as if the woman she'd never met had left behind a map showing that kindness was never a single act but a lineage, passed quietly from one heart to another until it reached those meant to carry it forward. She looked around the attic at the half-finished paintings, the worn journals, the window overlooking the same oak where Henry's locket still hung, and felt something click into place inside her chest, not like discovery but like recognition. Later that night, she gathered the residents in the great hall, holding Eleanor's letters in her hands. The fire flickered behind her, painting the walls in gold and amber. "These are her words," she said, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered. "Henry's wife believed that kindness doesn't stop with one person. It travels through gestures, through generations. This house isn't mine, and it was never his alone. It belongs to everyone willing to continue that chain." N. The room grew silent, filled with the quiet gravity of shared understanding. Some wept softly, others simply closed their eyes, letting her words settle like warm rain. It wasn't a speech, not really. It was a hand extended across time, connecting strangers through the invisible thread of mercy. Afterward, when everyone had gone to bed, Mara returned to the attic one last time. She placed the music box on the desk, wound its tiny crank, and listened as a trembling melody filled the air, soft, imperfect, beautiful. It was the kind of song that carried both sorrow and hope in equal measure, a sound that didn't ask to be remembered but simply refused to be forgotten. As she turned to leave, the moonlight spilled through the window, catching on the edges of her face, and for a fleeting moment it seemed as though the house itself exhaled a breath of completion, of peace. Long delayed, but finally found. Downstairs, the lights dimmed one by one, until only the faint glow of the attic remained, a small beacon against the darkness outside. The camera of the story would linger there, capturing the image of a woman standing in a room built by ghosts and gratitude, surrounded by words written for those who had never known they were loved. Then it would pull back slowly, leaving her framed in light and shadow, a living echo of everything Henry and Eleanor had believed, that kindness was never lost, only waiting for someone brave enough to carry it forward. The following winter arrived with a kind of quiet majesty, blanketing the mansion and the valley below in a whiteness so pure it seemed untouched by human sorrow. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the mornings carried the soft rhythm of shovels against the driveway, the familiar creak of old wood adjusting to the cold. To anyone passing by, the grand estate looked like a postcard of serenity. But within its walls, Mara felt a new tension, gathering not born of conflict, but of questions that refused to rest. She had built something beautiful out of kindness, yet she often wondered how long such fragile beauty could stand against time, greed, and the slow erosion of human memory. Richard Hale visited often, his hair now streaked with silver, his demeanor softer than before. They spent long evenings near the fire, talking about the strange turns of life, the way pain seemed to circle back into meaning when someone dared to love through it. One night, as the wind howled against the windows, he asked her a question that lingered long after the flames died. "Have you ever thought about what happens after you're gone?" he said gently. "What becomes of all this? The house, the people, the story?" Mara smiled faintly, tracing the rim of her teacup with a finger. "Stories don't end," she replied. "They just find new voices to tell them." Still, the question stayed with her. She began keeping a notebook, a kind of living will, not of money or property, but of lessons, small truths she wanted to leave behind. Each page began the same way. "If you are reading this, remember that kindness is not a gesture, it's an inheritance." Her handwriting, steady and elegant, filled page after page with stories of those who had come through the mansion's doors, the single mother who found work as a nurse, the veteran who opened his own cafe, the teenager who learned the piano and taught others to play. It became a catalog of redemption, an unbroken chain of compassion stretching far beyond her reach. But life, as it often does, found a way to test her faith again. One morning, Mara received a letter from the town council, a notice that the mansion's property taxes had doubled due to revaluation. The foundation's funds, already stretched thin, couldn't sustain such an increase. Richard advised her to appeal, but she knew it would take months, maybe years, and in that time the shelter could collapse. For the first time in years, fear settled in her chest, not for herself, but for the lives she had gathered beneath this roof. That evening, she sat alone in the library, surrounded by Eleanor's letters and Henry's portrait, both silent witnesses to her doubts. Snow fell thickly outside, muting the world into stillness. "I've done everything right," she whispered into the quiet. "But what if doing right isn't enough?" Her voice trembled, not with despair, but with exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones of those who have carried hope too long without rest. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found a young woman standing there, bundled in an oversized coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Miss Collins?" she asked shyly. "My name's Grace. My mother stayed here last year. You helped her get back on her feet." Mara nodded slowly, remembering the womankind eyes, calloused hands, a soft laugh that filled the kitchen. "I just wanted to bring you this," Grace continued, handing her a small envelope. "Mom said it's not much, but maybe it helps. Inside were a few crumpled bills and a note that simply read, "Because kindness deserves company." Mara's throat tightened as she looked up, but the girl was already gone, her figure vanishing into the snow. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, and felt something inside her lift, a quiet reminder that generosity, once given, always finds its way home. Over the next few weeks, similar envelopes began arriving, some hand-delivered, others mailed from neighboring towns. The amounts were small, sometimes just a few dollars, but they came with letters, stories, and blessings. A mechanic who had once repaired their old van sent a check. A woman from the next county sent homemade quilts. A former resident sent drawings made by her children. The total, when counted, was far less than what was needed to save the mansion. But somehow, it was enough to keep the lights on, to pay the bills, to buy another month of time. When spring returned, so did the town's warmth. The council, pressured by public support, agreed to reconsider the tax increase. The community, once indifferent, now stood guard over the house as though it were their own. Reporters called it the second miracle of Pine Hill. But Mara refused the interviews again. She simply smiled when asked how it felt to be saved. "It wasn't me who was saved," she said quietly. "It was the idea that we still care about one another." One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, she walked to the oak tree where Henry's locket still rested, glinting faintly in the fading light. She opened it, running her thumb over the tiny photograph of him and Eleanor, and felt a steady calm spread through her chest. "We're still here," she murmured. "Your promise kept its shape." As twilight deepened, the mansion's windows began to glow, one by one, until the whole house seemed to breathe. Inside, laughter spilled into the evening air, mingling with the scent of bread and pine and rain. The camera of life would drift upward now, showing the valley below, a scatter of homes lit like stars, each one reflecting the light born from that single act of compassion in a diner years ago. And as the scene faded into darkness, Mara's voice would echo softly, not as narration, but as a memory passed from one heart to another. "The world forgets so easily, but kindness remembers. It waits in strangers' hands, it lingers in letters left behind, and it blooms again wherever someone decides that goodness still matters." And the wind carried her words away, threading them through the trees until they vanished into the horizon, where the light of the mansion flickered one last time, steady, humble, and eternal. The late spring sun lingered longer each day, its light stretching across the mansion's wide lawns like a hand unwilling to let go. The trees swayed lazily in the mild wind, and the scent of lilac drifted in through the open windows, carrying with it the low hum of distant laughter from the residents. Yet beneath that serenity, an unease had begun to bloom again. Not the kind born from fear, but from something that felt heavier and more inevitable. The sense that the past was circling back, asking to be answered one final time. It began with a letter postmarked from New York, written in sharp, precise script and addressed to Miss Mara Collins, executor of the Lowell Foundation. Inside, the words were few but weighted. A legal representative of the Drake estate requests a meeting regarding pending restitution. Failure to attend may result in litigation. She read the note twice, the letters imprinting themselves into her thoughts, like faint bruises. It had been nearly a year since Samuel Drake's company had collapsed under scandal, his reputation left in ruins, his assets divided and contested. Mara had tried not to think about him again, but the world had its own way of reminding people that unfinished stories never stay buried for long. Richard insisted on accompanying her to the meeting. "Men like Drake don't die quietly," he said, folding the letter into his pocket. "And even if they do, their ghosts hire good lawyers." They met in a small conference room downtown, its glass walls overlooking the sleepy Vermont streets. The representative waiting for them was a woman in her 40s, her professionalism softened by the faint weariness of someone accustomed to apologizing for other people's damage. "Mr. Drake passed away 3 months ago," she began. "He left a letter addressed specifically to you, Miss Collins. Our firm has been instructed to deliver it personally." Mara's hands remained steady as she unfolded the envelope, but her heart betrayed her, pulsing in uneven rhythm beneath her calm expression. The letter inside was handwritten, the strokes uneven, as though penned by a man racing against time. "Mara Collins, I never learned how to lose with grace, but I suppose this is the only chance left to try. The world took everything I thought mattered, but it left me your story, and that was enough to make me see what I had become. I used to build walls of marble. You built bridges out of kindness. If there's anything left of me to give, let it be this. Whatever remains of my estate belongs to your foundation. I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask that you keep building what I destroyed." She read it in silence, the room shrinking around her until only the words remained words that tasted of remorse, too late and yet not meaningless. Richard exhaled softly, his expression unreadable. "That's one way to apologize," he said finally. Mara folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope. "Forgiveness isn't about what they deserve," she said quietly. "It's about what we choose to carry." When the transfer of Drake's remaining assets was finalized, it amounted to a fraction of what he'd once owned: a few properties, a modest sum, and a derelict community center on the edge of the city. But to Mara, it was more than restitution. It was a chance to redeem something broken. Over the next few months, she oversaw the restoration of the old center, transforming it into a second shelter for displaced families. The building opened quietly, without fanfare or speeches, just a simple sign above the door. "The Bridge House." News of the opening spread through local papers, stirring both curiosity and admiration. When a journalist asked if the name had been chosen to honor Henry Lowell or Samuel Drake, Mara smiled faintly and replied, "Both. One taught me that kindness builds bridges, and the other taught me what happens when we forget to cross them." The foundation's work expanded again, not because of wealth, but because of will, people drawn to the idea that good could outlast guilt. Volunteers arrived from other states, donations came from anonymous patrons, and soon the Bridge House became a symbol of quiet resilience. Yet through all the growth and gratitude, Mara remained unchanged. She still swept the front steps every morning, still brewed the first pot of coffee herself, still greeted each new arrival by name. Power had passed through her hands, but it never stayed. She let it flow outward, where it belonged. One afternoon, while overseeing repairs at the new center, she met a young lawyer who had recently joined the team, a tall, soft-spoken man with the same last name as Drake. He introduced himself simply as Evan. His voice carried both hesitation and sincerity. "He was my uncle," he admitted. "I didn't agree with what he did, but I wanted to help fix what's left of it." Mara studied him for a long moment, her eyes kind but unyielding. "Then maybe this is where your family's story changes," she said. They worked side by side for months, and in that shared labor something quiet began to take root. Not romance exactly, but understanding, the kind that grows only between people who have seen both ruin and grace. One evening, after the final inspection, Evan handed her a file containing the last of the transfer papers. "Everything's yours now," he said, but she shook her head. "No," she replied gently. "Everything's ours. Kindness doesn't belong to anyone. It just waits for someone willing to keep it alive." That night, Mara returned to the mansion and sat beneath the oak tree once more, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of spring rain. She thought of Henry and Eleanor, of Thomas, of Drake, of every name written and forgotten, each one part of the same imperfect story that had somehow found its way to her. She felt no triumph, no pride, only gratitude that she had been chosen to bear witness to the strange, enduring symmetry of compassion and consequence. The camera of life would pull back here, tracing her figure against the pale horizon, a woman, once defined by a single act in a diner, now standing at the crossroads of countless redemptions. The light would catch her hair, the wind would stir the leaves, and for a fleeting moment the world itself would seem to pause, as if bowing in acknowledgement. Then the scene would fade to dusk, leaving behind only her quiet whisper carried through the trees. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it, and with that truth the house, the hill, and the heart of the story would exhale together, not in ending, but in eternal continuation. By the time another winter came, the mansion no longer felt like a house at all. It had become a heartbeat stitched into the land itself. Snow layered softly over the roof like lace, and the old oak outside stood heavy with frost, its bare branches glinting beneath the silver morning light. Inside, the air hummed with warmth and quiet activity, the sound of breakfast being made, the shuffle of children's feet on the wooden floor, the low murmur of voices blending into a hymn of everyday life. Mara moved among them with unhurried grace, no longer the waitress who once counted tips to survive, but a woman whose quiet strength had rippled outward until it touched countless unseen shores. Richard Hale had retired at last, though he still visited on Sundays, bringing newspapers and half-hearted jokes about becoming a lawyer for angels. They would sit by the fireplace together, sharing coffee and memories that didn't need words. "You know," he said once, his voice softened by the years, "you never asked for any of this, and yet you carried it better than anyone could." Mara smiled, eyes distant but full. "Maybe that's why it worked," she replied. "The best things in life are the ones that find you when you aren't looking." Her health had begun to fade quietly, the way a candle flickers long before it goes dark. She didn't fear it. She had seen too much life to be afraid of its rhythm. Instead, she spent her final months writing small notes to those who had crossed her path, each one beginning the same way. "If you ever doubt that goodness matters, remember what this house became." She tucked the notes between books, inside teacups, beneath cushions, places where they would be found by accident years after she was gone, tiny reminders that kindness was still alive somewhere. One evening, she walked alone to the oak tree, her coat buttoned against the wind, her hands wrapped around a small candle. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the valley below